Hi everyone, and welcome to another part of this sort of webinar series. I'm James Daniel, I'm Director and Founder of Precision Grazing, and I'm joined by Phil.
Hello, I'm Phil Pengelly from the Penwith Landscape Partnership, and I'm the Farm Environment Officer.
Cool, yeah, thanks for joining us, Phil. And so between the two of us, we're going to talk through, I guess, everything to do with spring grazing management, looking at what's our targets for spring grazing, talking about different groups of animals that might be on the farm at the moment, and also touching on how can we increase pasture productivity this year, and what role does nitrogen fertiliser play? And what an interesting year 2022 is turning into. High commodity prices, particularly within dairy, but being chased by even higher rates of inflation on inputs. So there's some good opportunity out there to change our systems, and there's some really tangible things we can do if we adjust our grazing management, and we'll see those effects in this season, which is really good value.
And I guess, James, the biggest question on a lot of people's minds is going to be the price of fertiliser. It's going to, I've heard a lot of people say, "Oh dear, never thought it would get this expensive."
No, sure. And it, as I said, the commodities have gone up, so we're going to see really good prices of milk this year, beef and lamb, record highs. The rate of inflation on inputs is greater than the increase in price for those outputs. So it's something to be mindful of. In some ways, nitrogen fertiliser may still be giving a good return on investment in the right system, but before we use it, we should have everything else right first. And this was always the case, but when it was cheaper, we were getting away with it. So we have a good look at our farm systems now and make sure we're doing everything else right. We'll touch on that in the presentation. Grazing management, how often we move the animals in particular, has a huge role to play in supporting the viability of farm businesses this year. So it's going to be a really good thing to focus on, and it's going to give some tangible results to people that can make changes. So without further ado, we're going to share this presentation with everyone and then make it nice and big. So hopefully everyone can see that. Can you see that your side, Phil?
Yep.
Okay, lovely. So we should be able to get into it. So this is looking at spring grazing management, and we're going to sort of touch on a few other areas that are related to it as we go in. So okay, so our overall aims is we'd like to, in most cases, graze the whole farm by the end of April. And there's a few reasons for doing that. By setting that as a target, it kind of forces us to turn stock out maybe earlier than we're normally comfortable with doing, ground conditions permitting, of course. And grazing those grass or grazing those plants stimulates them, sort of kickstarts their growth. It might remove any leaves that have deteriorated over the winter, so it improves the pasture quality for the next grazing rotation, and it gets animals transitioned to pasture, ready to just make sure the ruminants have time to adjust to grass, so that when the real growth comes along, hopefully in May, they're fully transitioned and they're ready to grow or produce milk. Which is going to happen.
And all these things will be true of any type of pasture, James, whether it's sort of a new reseed or whether it's a permanent pasture that's been there for 10 years, I suppose. Yeah.
Some of this is sometimes hard to start in year one. So, to graze the whole farm at the end of April, it assumes there's grass on the farm. And if the animals were left out for a long time, or if last year's management wasn't ideal, there's a lot of set stocking on the farm where the animals were allowed just to be in one area for a long time. It really depletes the grass plants of their energy over the season, and so there's not a lot of grass left around in the spring. For those that manage to rest their fields or paddocks over winter, they're finding, because of the mild winter, there's a lot of grass on farm this spring, and it's there to be used. If we can use it efficiently, we'll make really good gains this season. So setting a target for the business to say we're going to graze the whole farm, and when I say the whole farm, this is obviously the grazing fields, but it's quite often the silage fields as well if they're grazable, i.e. if they've got a water supply and they're close to the farm and so on. So that really extends the area available for grazing. And it's going to be a personal decision for the business whether they're going to graze the silage land or not, but most cases it's worth doing, especially in the sheep and beef business, because it gets stock out the sheds earlier, and if the stock go out earlier, you need less silage. And we can get trapped in a vicious circle on farms sometimes, particularly in the UK, where cows or livestock don't get turned out as early because the farm's being shut up early to make silage to feed the animals that are indoors that can't go out because you're making silage.
Yep.
And so that cycle takes a bit of confidence to break, but it's worth doing or trying with a group or two at least. And ideally, all the animals should be out in April, transitioning to pasture, so they're ready to grow and perform when that sort of grass surplus comes along later in the month, or certainly along in May. So you know, lots of other benefits for grazing during spring. Okay, stimulates the grass growth, increases the animal performance quite often because it lifts the energy in the diet. Energy and protein levels increase. If they're coming off silage or even coming off silage and concentrate, the grass will be higher value, higher energy and protein than the feed they're currently on. So you get a bit of a lift in performance. It improves the pasture quality, increases tillering, and it sort of helps set up the farm for grazing. So it builds what we call this grass wedge, where rather than the farm all being the same height, you get this stepped approach where some paddocks have got more grass and some have got less. And that means that the farm starts to get to this rest, this graze and rest cycle going on, which is what we want to see.
Okay. At home, James, we've been we had a couple of fields of Swedes that we use for culinary sales, and what we've been doing is grazing those off as a first grazing, really, prior to going on the grass, just to let the grass get ahead of it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so anything you can do to kind of that winter hungry gap, as they quite often call it, that February March time. If you get a cold March, can be quite hard to fill. So having those brassica crops, whether they were grown for livestock or grown for other purposes, is really useful. But it's just keeping an eye on the grass covers and saying, if I'm going to graze all my fields by the end of April, when should I start grazing? With that in mind, because it's easy to hold off, and then all of a sudden you get to mid-April or the end of April, you've got loads of grass.
Yeah, that's the problem.
You're losing the quality and it's getting ahead of the animals, and you're taking more out for silage than you intended to. So it's just worth it. It's a really good time of year. If people haven't got out and walked the farm yet, or driven around the farm to see what's there, really good time to do it now in the next week. So the first week of April, walk the whole farm, see what's on hand, and kind of think to yourself, if you're walking around, okay, we've got a 4 acre, 6 acre field here, whatever. How long, for the group of animals I'm thinking of putting here, how long do I think it will take them to graze the field? And if you're looking at the field and you're going, I think actually they could be here a couple of weeks, it's time to get them out, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
So that's it. If you can't see the toe of your boots because the grass is that long, it's time to get animals out. Reduce workload if they're inside now, reduce costs for feeding and all that machinery, the cost of fuel now. Anything we do to reduce cost is going to be big benefit to do so. I know that pasture quality. I'm involved through precision grazing with a project in Wales. Reason for showing it here is that there's 16 farms in Wales, half dairy and half beef and sheep, and they're measuring a range of pasture types. It's 15 there measured in that table. This was all taken in the middle of March, these results. This Wales, so similar climates, a lot of guys on the west coast there that are part of that sample. But look at the quality, protein and dry matter of those samples. And this isn't brand new lays, this is a range of pastures from permanent right through to new lays. And consistently, everything's over 12 ME or very close to it. Proteins, mid-20s, and dry matters, low to mid-20s. So this is the perfect feed on farm. You wouldn't be able to buy this in, and this is sat in the fields now, ready to be eaten. So no issue with quality in spring, even on permanent pastures and older pastures, as long as it's green leaf. So if it's white or yellow, it's going to be poorer quality. If it's green leaf and starting to grow, it'll be high quality regardless of the age of pasture. There's also a bit of a kind of rule of thumb, as we could call it, that if you graze your pasture by the end of April, you'll grow an extra ton of dry matter, so an extra ton of dry matter pasture per hectare by the end of May. So that grazing event stimulates the grass to grow. And if you have 2 paddocks, and this is what the kind of bars at the bottom are showing, you've got 2 paddocks, it's you and the neighbour, you get out and you graze something, by the middle of March, you take out 1,000 kilos per hectare, your neighbour doesn't, he just leaves it there. His is going to grow more slowly. So by the 1st of May, a couple months later, he's gained 400 kilos, but your pasture's almost regrown back to where his is, and you grazed it as well. So he's gained 400 kilos and you've gained 1,600 kilos by grazing it early. So that's a really tangible amount of grass that comes for free just by grazing. And it's something that a lot of the grass-based dairy farms do very well. They'll definitely get around and graze the whole farm by the end of April. Obviously, they've got the infrastructure, they've got the flexibility to do so, but it's something beef and sheep farmers can certainly aspire to do. And because the dairy farmers do it, they get this extra grass. And people looking over the fence say, oh yeah, it's because they use all this slurry or they're spreading a lot of fertiliser. Sometimes true, but it's also true that grazing management is on point is gaining them this extra grass, which gives them more scope for silage making, or might put more grass on the farm at the end of the year. It also enables them to turn out earlier, the shorter housing period. So easy in farming to get stuck in a bit of a cycle that's a bit negative. If we can break out of it and tap into some of these benefits, really tangible use on farm. 1,000 kilos of dry matter at 12 ME, we could say is the same as buying in a ton of feed. It's actually worth a bit more than a ton of feed, because a ton of feed's not 100% dry matter, it's 86% or 90% dry matter. So if a ton of feed's going to cost us what, £360, £350 this week, then that's what we gained per hectare. So we've got a 10-hectare field or a 50-hectare farm, then our value, our gain is approaching into thousands of pounds. 3.5 grand for 10 hectares. So 50 hectares, we're talking 15, 18 grand.
Yep, that's pretty important at the moment, isn't it?
Oh, it's huge, absolutely huge. Benefit on farm, because it's funny, isn't it? Because the cost of everything's gone up, all the inputs have gone up. The value from good management is so much higher. They used to talk about if you measured grass or you did some activities around grazing management planning, that was £200 an hour work. Well, with the rate of inflation on inputs, that's probably become £350 an hour work. So all the things you can do on farm, it's huge value to it. An hour spent. It's
amazing how necessity drives things forward.
Yeah. So and if we get really technical, then it's just a planner that someone like a dairy farm might use, and they've gone out and measured their grass, and you can use things like this. They call it a spring rotation plan or spring grazing planner. And what it does, it sets the area to graze per day to ensure that you graze the whole farm by the end of April or whatever the target date is. And so it gives a really structured way of doing it. That's on the right hand side, and you see the hectares per day along the bottom is increasing, and the rotation length is reducing. So it just gives a really every week, a dairy farmer could allocate a bit more grass to the cows, and they'd make up the difference with silage. And beef and sheep farmers can use this as well. They can say, look, I've got 40 hectares to graze. I've got 30 days to graze it in. So 40 hectares divided by 30 gives me the area to graze per day. Okay, so it's 1.2 hectares to graze per day. How many animals is that going to support? How many cows or cattle, bullocks, growing cattle could I turn out to graze that area? And you might turn out half of what you think, and then top up the rest as you go through the month. It was very lucky this season. End of May, end of March now, growing conditions are very, very good, and I think they're unlikely to get bad because of how good they are now. So we have quite a bit of confidence with getting stock out of sheds at the moment. On the left hand side is more a simple planner, and again, it's all about giving people the confidence to get out early, because the only reason for not going out early is the fear of running out of grass. You start grazing too early and you get caught out. It comes in cold April. We may still see it pretty well. And you run out of grass, and you've got this big hungry gap that you're trying to fill, and it's really awkward because everything's out in the sheds and hard to feed. So the plan on the left says, well, for a dry farm, they do 40% of the farm in the first 5 weeks, and then 60% in the last 3. So again, so that 40 hectares to graze, if we started early enough, so this would start at 1st of March. If we'd started early enough, we'd say, okay, so we're going to graze 40%, I'm going to graze 16 hectares in the first 5 weeks. So you'd work out what area that was per day and turn out the animals to suit. And the heavy farm, which is the wetter farm, starts grazing a bit later and does its 40% in 3 weeks and then 60% in 4 weeks. So it covers the ground a bit quicker, less risk of causing any damage to the ground by moving quicker. But those sort of templates can be really useful for kind of structuring the approach to grazing the farm. We're past the beginning of March now, so what we're probably working on is tactics to graze all of the area that we can by the end of April or by the end of the first week of May, depending on kind of, I guess, fertility of the farm and how this grass start growing quickly. And if we are going to go out and graze, then quite often we'd aim for fields, so what we call in the middle of the wedge. So they're the fields with the medium amount of grass in them, not the most, not the least, but the medium amount of grass. The thought behind that is that grazing those fields in the first week, because your animals are transitioning to pasture, they're sometimes more wasteful of the grass that's there because they're moving around a bit more, but as the ruminants adjust, they're not grazing as tidily as they will do once they're transitioned. Sometimes growing conditions are wetter. and there's more wastage on a wet day, but there's less wastage if the covers are a bit lower. So it's a bit of a tactic to say if growing conditions are, if it's wet or if animals are transitioning to grass, don't put them in the field with the most grass straight away. Put them in the field with the third or fourth most grass, so they can get used to it there, and then they'll go and do a really clean job of grazing the field with the most grass in it.
If you did sort of start grazing, James, and it come in as a wet week, what would your advice be in that circumstance, please?
Because of where growing conditions are at the moment, if we've got the infrastructure to be able to move animals regularly, so I can move them every couple of days, allocate a fresh area to them, then I wouldn't be concerned. Right. If I didn't have the infrastructure to move them, then I'd consider put them in the drier or driest field, or even housing the animals again, because we always have that option. We can always bring animals back in and put them back on the silage before taking them out again. So we can be pretty flexible. Yep. Certainly with dry stocks, with growing animals, obviously more difficult with things like sheep, ewes and lambs, but they won't have the impact. Cows and calves, we're mindful of what weather conditions are forecast. But being flexible, picking the dry fields. If it's dry now, graze the wetter fields with the medium amount of grass in them, and then save the drier fields for when it becomes wet, if that's possible. But in April, if we get a wet period, it doesn't last forever, and we've got long days, so we never see too much of a challenge in April managing things in a normal year.
Okay, thank you.
So when it comes to cows, and so what I've done is grouped. So cows, this is all lactating cows, so beef and dairy, all talked about in this slide. Anything that's lactating is the highest priority on the farm, because it's lactating, so it's got the biggest feed demand. It's potentially going to be producing the most money as well, or earning the most money, or has the potential to, because lactating. So they should be fed to appetite where possible. And it's key, that they're fully fed up to and at peak lactation. So the thing about peak lactation is that once they've calved, in case of these cows, their milk supply and sort of other developments is sort of ramping up, and it does this over a period of 6 weeks. The volume of milk supplied at week 6, that then sets the total volume they'll produce for the rest of that lactation. So if they're in poor condition or they're underfed at the point of week 6, there's nothing you can do to get that back. No, so cow's genetic potential is 30 litres a day at week 6, and because of her feeding body conditions, she only actually gives 25 at week 6. Well, that's set it's never going to be more than 25 then. That's set the slope of that curve. It's only going to decline over the rest of the lactation. So
management at that point in the lactation is really vital, James.
Really important. So depending on when you calve, will depend when week 6 is. As nature would design it, the cow would calve, for him, I guess in West Cornwall, probably in April sometime, so that when by mid-May, she's on ad lib feed, because in mid-May everything's growing flat out. We've got long days, good temperatures. There's as much grass as she can eat, and then that sets her up for a really strong lactation. I guess as farming systems have changed a bit, and with artificial nitrogen, we kind of be able to push that growth artificially forwards. So guys are calving earlier, so their peak lactation comes in mid-April, and that's been fine in a good April. It's been really challenging in a poor April. It means a lot of feed's got to come in to kind of hit that peak lactation. And, it probably is still economically viable, thanks to the increase in milk price for most producers, to still feed the cow if they need to get her to achieve a peak, because it's sort of money well spent to set that up. Within beef, I wouldn't suggest feeding concentrate unless there's not enough grass available or not enough silage on farm to feed the cow. And having a good look at body condition as well will help make that decision. So, what does it mean to feed an animal or feed a cow ad lib? It means a minimum pasture height of around 10 centimetres. Okay, now 10 centimetres would be what you would measure with a ruler if you put it into the pasture, and it should be sort of green leaf for at least half of that ruler. So, if you've got older pasture or pasture that's not been managed as well in previous seasons and it's not green leaf, then take that into account. So that's it for improved pasture, which is all green. Half of that should be really good green leaf, and the other half should be sort of the sheaths around the stem and so on. If we're measuring the plate meter, that would probably plate meter at around 2,400 kilos of dry matter per hectare. But the 10 centimeters is a good rule of thumb. That's ankle height for most people in a pair of welly boots. That would be sort of a set stocking environment where the cows are just in the field. If we're doing something like a rotational grazing system, we're aiming to graze covers between 2.8 to 34, so between 2,800 and 3,400. So in terms of ruler, that's going to be sort of 15 to 20 centimeters. Raising that down to kind of 4 to 5 centimeters, or 1,500 to 1,700 kilos of dry matter. Rule of thumb: 1 hectare is going to last 100 cows for 24 hours, or feed 100 cows for 24 hours, assuming they're getting 2 or 3 kilos of concentrate in the parlour still at that stage of lactation. For beef cows, again, that rule of thumb would work fine. That means 1 acre is going to last 40 cows and their calves a day. So just nice and easy. As we said, beef breeds can reach their peak yield from forage alone, so concentrate feeding wouldn't be needed or justified, especially at current prices, unless pasture quantity was insufficient. So the height's getting too low, there's no other feed on farm, can't graze the silage area. Okay, we ought to do something, because if we do now, if we help them reach their peak, we're going to get heavier calves and weaning. Simple as that. For some dairy breeds, concentrate feeding may also be justified if the yield response is good. Really useful to check the return on that investment. If we're buying in anything this year, if we spend £1, what's it going to give us back? Because £1 at the moment is not buying us much. It's not buying us much diesel, it's not buying us much food or fertiliser. So we need to check that its use is justified. Talking about ewes, so similar story, they're super high priority and they should be fed to appetite where possible. Peak lactation's earlier for ewes, so it's 3 weeks post lambing. Depending on when they lamb, that might be now, might have gone already, or might be in a couple of weeks. Again, the milk they produce at peak sets their potential lactation, or sets the volume of milk they produce for the rest of that lactation curve, and that's going to affect the total weight of lamb weaned per ewe, which is a really key KPI in terms of productivity. To feed them ad lib means maintaining a minimum pasture height, or an average pasture height of 6 centimeters, or 1,800 kilos of dry matter per hectare. So again, that's going to be kind of level with the heel of yours, so you cover the toe of the boot if you're standing in the paddock. If the feed or the pasture height drops below that target, yes, concentrate feeding could well be justified in that case. But again, think about, can we graze a silage field? We'd better to do that, especially if it's before the end of April, because we'll stimulate the growth of the field and we'll get some feed and we'll help the produce peak or meat to their peak as well. Again, big thing in sheep farming is that the ewes are normally quite often underfed, don't hit peak, and then the lambs are lighter at weaning, and then they're on farm longer in the season, and we have less grass over winter, so we have less grass in the spring, so the ewes don't hit their peak, so the lambs are lighter at weaning. And the situation repeats itself each year until we break it. So just something to be aware of in that enterprise. Growing cattle, or any growing cattle is just going to be growing or finishing cattle, or probably even perhaps replacement heifers for the beef or dairy herd. With them, we're looking to transition them to pasture, so their rumen and the bacteria and biology in it is fully adjusted before peak pasture growth arrives. So if you've got the biggest kind of, I guess, mistake that people could make with their growing cattle or growing animals is to keep them in too long, turn them out late, have loads of grass ahead of them, and then the spring growth arrives and it all goes to seed, and the animals haven't even got used to eating it yet.
And can I just ask, is buffer feeding a good idea at this stage, James?
If it gives the option to turn animals out earlier, so you've walked around the field or the block those animals are going to go to, and you're like, grain conditions are good, but there's not quite enough grass here yet. So what should I do? Should I keep them in a couple more weeks or a week, or could I put them out here and, as you say, introduce some sort of buffer feed? Again, as the dairy farmers are able to do with a bit more flexibility, then that's absolutely fine. So a ring feeder or some hay out, or ideally silage out in the paddock to help them sort of be on grass for 3/4 of the diet, 1/4 on forage. Make sure you don't go too quickly. Then that's great. It's a really good way of transitioning the animals. The perfect transition period would be out by day, in by night. Kind of getting them used to pasture, building it up to be 100% of the diet over 2 or 3 weeks. Not always the option because of infrastructure, but it's something to aspire to. If they're being fed any concentrate now, regardless of amount, really trying to step that back down over a period of 2 to 4 weeks So if they're on a couple of kilos, you can step it down over a week. If they're on 4 kilos, it would be stepped down over 3 or 4 weeks to help them transition, and not to kind of see a big check in growth. Again, check the economics of doing so. Concentrate feeding at pasture. Well, I suggest for any native breeds, whether it's pure or if they're crosses, wouldn't be economically justified, assuming there's sufficient feed. So they should be able to do it on grass as long as you feed them enough grass. And that comes down to grazing management instead. So the focus will be on grazing management, not on buying feed, because for a ton of feed, you could do quite a lot about grazing management in the same for the same money. And the grazing management would stand you a lot longer in the season. For continental breeds, look, feeding a high source of energy might be needed, and quite often is needed during the finishing phase to get that sort of enough fat cover to meet specification. Again, check your grid. What are you trying to do? Are you being rewarded for sending really fat cattle? And if you're not, don't do it. It's going to be very expensive to get cattle overfit this year, either overweight or overfat. Cool. So the next section is going to be about increasing the pasture productivity. And we can just quite convincingly say, or I can say with confidence, that how long animals spend in one field or paddock, thinking about paddock being part of a field, how long they spend there is the single factor that's the greatest influence on the amount of pasture grown. So again, we take 2 fields side by side, 2 neighbours. One has a field that's 10 acres, and the other one's got the same field, another field, 10 acres. One farmer splits that field in 4, gives them 4 paddocks. The other farmer doesn't. They both put in the same amount of animals, and the farmer on the left, if you like, just leaves them there in the 10-acre field. The farmer on the right, because he's got 4 paddocks, moves them every week. By the end of the season, the farmer on the right with the 4 paddocks, his animals guaranteed will be heavier. Or they'll be heavier, and he may have cut silage in that field. There will be a lot more benefit coming from that field by that change in management. So it's the same soil type, the same rainfall, the same climate, same altitude, may even have been the same pasture type. No matter what similarities there were, that change in management over all the other things that could have been done would have given the biggest benefit, and benefit in that season. So even if the farmer on the left reseeded his field to increase its productivity, you won't see the benefit this year, won't be till next year, and it will cost them a lot of money. He could put on loads of fertiliser, he still struggle to beat the amount of grass being grown, because the grazing management will be useful even when moisture is low, even when it's cold, even when it's wet, it will still work. Whereas the fertiliser will be variable depending on conditions. So, how long animals spend in one field, or how often animals move, that will have the biggest influence. Why does it work? Well, if you look at the graph on the right-hand side, once a plant's been grazed, it takes a while as the leaves regrow, using the energy through photosynthesis, for the root reserves or for the energy reserves in the plant to be fully replenished. Once they're replenished, it means it will regrow really quickly after grazing. If the animals are in one field all the time, they'll go around, graze the plants, and then they'll come back when it's at one or two leaf stage and graze the plant again. The energy reserves are low. It means that the next regrowth takes longer to come back. So the productivity of the field, the vigor at which new growth appears, declines over the season. And we see this on farm. By the time we get to June, July, August, September, the field of farm that's been set stocked where animals have continually eaten all the plants, that's really running out of puff. And if it goes a bit dry or something, growth just seems to stall, and animals just roam around being underfed. Whereas the farm that's had this paddock system set up, keeps growing grass through the dry periods, the cold periods. Growth changes, but it never stops. And that's all about the energy reserves being replenished. It's working with nature rather than against it. If we took away all the hedges and we brought back some predators, the animals would move around. They wouldn't just stay in one area all the time. They graze an area, go away, and then come back when it's recovered. So we've got to help them do that, help work with nature, and we'll be rewarded with a lot more productivity. How much productivity? Well, if we look at the graph there, if I put on some lines so we can see it, let's make it I reckon. If we're set stocking at the minute, so the animals are spending, so rather than, we don't have to worry about the name of the technique, because there's lots of different techniques out there. what's really important is how long do they spend in one field or paddock. So if they're spending a long time in one field or paddock, the total pasture being utilised in terms of dry matter per hectare is reasonably low. We know that's the case on most average farms. It's around 4 tonnes a hectare. However, if we move the animals more often, so we move them with enough paddocks or fields per group, so they can move every 3 to 6 days or 2 to 3 times a week, we grow a lot more grass, and we also utilise a lot more grass as well. So we might increase our utilisation by 56%. That looks like an extra 3.3 tonnes of dry matter per hectare. So we said before, a tonne of dry matter is worth what, £350 if we have to replace it with feed. So by changing our management, we can grow an extra 3 tonnes per hectare. Well, that's worth, if we to buy that in with feed, that's worth £1,000 per hectare. If we try to do it with fertiliser, and let's say we've got really fertile land, so we can get a good response from our fertiliser, well, that's the equivalent of applying something like 220 kilos of nitrogen per hectare, or 5 bags an acre, at a cost of £410 per hectare, or £160 per acre. And this is the difference, isn't it? If we put in some infrastructure, or we put in a bit more time, however we're going to do it, if we set up to do this, to move animals 2 or 3 times a week, rather than just leaving where they are, if we do it with infrastructure, we put in some fences, we put in a couple of extra troughs, or we change where the trough is in the field so we can get to it more easily. We'll do that once, and it'll be there for the next 10, 20, 30 years. The fertiliser not only costs us more, but it's got to be done every year. So you think about the impact you could have. You could say, well, we'll do it with fertiliser, we'll spend the extra £410 a hectare each year. 10 years later, you spent an extra £4,000 per hectare. Whereas what you could have done is spent maybe £100 an acre once on infrastructure, or even £10 an acre on infrastructure. The infrastructure cost to set up fences or to move fences is super, super low. And you normally just do it once and it's there forever, or there for a long time. Whereas your fertiliser and feed, you've got to keep buying every year to get the same response. And that's just the fertiliser cost. That's not the cost of spreading it. So it's the fuel, the labour, the tractor, the machine, the spreader, the depreciation, all those other things that go with it. We don't get anything for free. It's always a cost involved. So yeah, it's just worth a thing about, what am I going to spend my time and money on this year? What's going to give the best return on my investment? And infrastructure, creating more paddocks is by 100% going to give the best return on investment this year, when you can increase how often animals move by making sure they've got more paddocks or fields available. Good. So each group of animals needs to have access to a minimum of 5 fields or paddocks. So a paddock's a field that's been split in half, let's say. The field or paddock must have a water supply for it to be called a field, and it must have a secure boundary so animals can stay in it. How big should that field or paddock be? Well, if they can't graze it down to a suitable height within 6 days, it should be split in half, as required, with temporary electric fencing or something else. If you don't have enough fields or don't want to spend any money, then why not make the groups of animals bigger? So if you've got 10 groups on the farm, think about, how can I have less groups? Because if I have less groups, then I'll have more fields per group. So what can I do? I'm running 2 groups of 30 steers. Well, can I run 1 group of 60 steers? And then I've twice as many fields per group. So, and we can do that quite often without spending any money, as long as our water supply is adequate. So it's just got to keep an eye on water flow rates and so on, and check that they're okay. Some tangible rules of thumb that you can kind of apply to your own farm. To have good pasture productivity by working with nature, we want to spend 1 to 5 days per field or paddock, maximum 6, ideally 1 to 5. We want to give a rest period of 20 to 45 days. So we graze the field or paddock, don't come back for 20 to 45 days, depending on the time of year. What that means is that per group of animals, ideally, or we want to have at least 4 to 6 fields or paddocks, ideally 8 to 10, and 12 to 16 would be perfect. The less time we spend per field or paddock, the more grass we will grow. Rule of thumb in New Zealand when I was out there was, the bigger your overdraft, the more often you should move your animals, because the more grass you'll grow, the more milk or meat you'll produce per hectare to pay the bills with.
Can I just ask, James, you were saying about sort of water troughs and flow rate, what sort of flow rate will we be looking at for a group of bullocks, as you were discussing, sort of 60?
Yeah, so if there's a group of 60 animals and they're 400 kilos, then you're going to be needing somewhere around 6 to 8 litres per minute to the trough, assuming it's a larger trough. So it's 400 litre trough, 6 to 8 litres per minute to supply that group. If it was dairy cows, we had 100 dairy cows. Each cow would drink in 90 to 100 litres per day. They'll consume that over about 7 hours. So then we're talking a flow rate of around 20 litres per minute. You're being supplied to a trough that's 800 or 1,000 litres.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you.
Okay, so that gives us some rules of thumb. You know, the more often we move the animals, the more grass will grow. Really simple. So we can gear that up and down. To be doing, to get this benefit, we need 4 to 6 paddocks or fields per group of animals. We can get there by splitting our existing fields in half or putting animals together. You know, if we've got a mixed farm with sheep and beef, well, why not put the sheep and beef together to make larger groups? And they call that a flood. It's a flock and a herd. And there's other benefits. There's a worm kind of control benefit. There's a pasture quality benefit by putting those groups together. So really handy chart, and we'll go to that page. So this chart gives us a couple of things. If we look at the number of paddocks or fields per group along the top, and then we go down and we look at the on time, how long they spend per paddock, the numbers in the middle, which is highlighted in green within that box, that's the rest period. So within grazing management, we talk about things like we either talk about rest period or rotation length. They're nearly the same thing. The rest period is the number of paddocks times by the on time minus the time they spend in one of the paddocks. So if we look there at 8, we've got 8 paddocks or fields for this group. We're going to spend 3 days per paddock. The rotation length is 3 times 8, is 24. The rest period is 21. So the paddock, after it's grazed, gets 21 days to recover before the next grazing. And that's kind of as short a rest period as most farmers would need to give to control peak growth. Then equally, that 8 paddocks per group, or 8 paddocks or fields per group, if we spend 6 days per paddock, which is the top end of how many days we want to spend, gives a rest period of 42 days. Well, 42 days, that is going to get you through a dry period, or that's going to kind of manage your grazing during a sort of early spring or an autumn graze. So you see where 8 paddocks per group give really good flexibility. 4 gives the minimum amount of flexibility needed. And if you can do 4, why not try and do 6? I say it might not even need a single extra fence. It may just be about sort of combining groups together to have enough fields per group. What area do we require? Well, if it worked last year, just do the same again and be prepared for it to work better. So sometimes it doesn't need to be complicated. You know what you did last year, do the same, just try and get more paddocks or fields. Try and move animals more often this year to get the benefit of extra grass growth, just naturally. If it's a new block or the numbers have changed and you're saying, well, how do I actually plan for this? Well, if we know what pasture's growing, that's pasture growth on the left-hand side in kilos of dry matter per hectare. So if we start to measure grass, then we know what our growth rates are. We can work out the stocking rate. We've got a stocking rate there for different stock classes in either animals per hectare or animals per acre. Most farms with a reasonable amount of fertility, so soil pH is in range, it's new or improved permanent pasture, they're going to grow something between 30 to 40 kilos of dry matter per hectare per day during the grazing season, being kind of 1st of May through to the end of September. So if we said, okay, so I've got my grains of reasonable good quality, I'll plump for a kind of number in the middle, so we say 36 kilos, well, that gives us our stocking rate. So we go along there, suckler cows, a cow an acre. People will be working on that for turnout. In most cases, that will be right. The nice thing with this is that if you match last year's stocking rate on a block and you're moving the animals 2 or 3 times as often as they were last year, what's going to happen is you're going to get to a point where you'd normally apply fertiliser and not need it. Or you're going to get to a time of the year where you think, well, we just get pinched for grass in June or something, and you're not going to be pinched. So the outcome's always going to be better. You'll be able to take some silage off that block where you don't do normally, and that's sort of free silage that's coming out of that system. And that's going to help save the need for so much nitrogen on some of the other silage ground. So it's going to be all benefits. There's going to be benefits that will come from this. If we're measuring grass, and there's a project called Grass Check GB, which various farmers across the UK measure grass. You can sign up to their weekly bulletins and see what grass growth rates are, and that can give you an idea of kind of how to manage the system. As you can see, taking an average line from the sheep and beef farmers between the 1st of May and the end of September, average growth across farmers, sheep and beef farmers across the UK was about 44 kilos of dry matter per hectare. So that supports the average stocking rate. With dairy, it was a bit higher. It was probably around 50, 55 kilos. And so for dairy farmers on the grazing platform, that looks like 3.3 cows a hectare before supplements. Okay, what we can do this. In our next section, we'll have a bit of a chat about the role of nitrogen. So what have you been hearing from people, Phil, in terms of nitrogen?
One or two people have said to me, James, I can't, I don't want to spend a lot of money on nitrogen, so I'm going to cut my stock numbers.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so that could be a really sensible position. On farm we've got the grass growing through management of fertility. Let's say it sits there, and then we've got the grass growing with nitrogen that sits on top. So the grass growing with nitrogen is helping the farm carry extra stock over and above what it would be able to carry kind of naturally. So if the grazing management is really good, because nitrogen is more expensive, drop off the stock that's been carried by nitrogen, because the return on investment, you're not getting enough money for the weight being produced with the grass that's been growing for nitrogen. That makes sense. However, if the farm's just set stocking and grazing management's poor, well, the first thing to do would be to change the management, and then you could lift the grass, you could lift that natural grass growth from where it was to probably where it was, and that would normally be above where it would be with nitrogen. So they could maintain their stocking rate and not use any nitrogen. And economically for the business, that would be far better off than cutting stock numbers alone. Sure. So it'd be a business reviewing and simply saying, how often do I move my animals? If the answer isn't twice a week, there's massive potential there to increase grass growth simply through making that part of the business, enacting that in the business, and not having to use maybe any nitrogen. Because most UV farmers are quite low users of nitrogen, and when management's also pretty low, the potential is huge. You don't use any nitrogen, change the management, maintain stock numbers. Sure. So that would be the answer. Right, we'll get back to that screen. You see that screen, Phil? Nitrogen on the side. Lovely. So artificial nitrogen, it boosts growth, doesn't it? It gives that lifting growth. We produce more dry matter with it. The cost, there's been a cost, but it's given a return on investment for several years. The cost has tripled. We're not getting enough for meat or milk to justify it in many businesses. So what the focus should be, and what the focus should always have been, is on making sure everything else is right. So if we do use it, we get a really good response. And if everything else is right, we won't have to use as much of it anyway. So, fundamentally, everything starts and finishes with the soil. So focusing on soil health, getting the soil tested, looking at all the minerals, not just the N, P, and K, or not just the P and K, correcting the pH, where pH needs correction. So money spent on lime will give a really good return on investment this year. Looking at the soil structure, taking a spade around, digging a hole. The nitrogen fixing bacteria, which exist in a healthy soil, is how everything else that isn't fertilized keeps growing. That's why your lawn looks green and keeps growing. They need oxygen to work. There's an aerobic process. So if the soil is compacted, if it's got a pan in it somewhere, if the surface is plugged or trafficked, then that's not, those natural systems can't function as well or at all. So fix the root, look to fix the root cause of the problem, because it's going to be worth a lot to do so. Again, fixing P and K issues, whether organically or inorganically, will also be worthwhile. When it comes to fertiliser, when you're going to use any, timing is critical. We'll touch on that a bit later on. Slurry is also worth a lot more because the cost of the inputs have gone up. So getting the slurry tested to see what it contains, really, really valuable. Getting the soil tested. If you haven't had the test done for 2 or 3 years and you're highly stocked, well worthwhile finding out where you are and working out how to use things effectively. What's also going to make the most difference to a majority of businesses, again, it's the grazing management. So again, have a look. How much time are you spending? How often are the animals being moved? And if the answer is not, I move all my animals twice a week, then there's significant gains to be made there. So that is worth a lot more. Yeah, that's worth a lot more than nitrogen being used in most businesses. If we can change the grazing management, then great. If we can't, it's in some dairy farmers, grazing management is really on point. Soil health's been looked at. They're doing a lot of things right. So the next point is to step back and look at the farm business. Are we carrying more animals than the farm can support? And yeah, it worked last year and the year before. How much is the milk price going to lift? And how many animals do we want to carry? Where are we most profitable is the question. And most of the profit on a farm is coming from the milk or meat produced from grazed grass. And the silage and the supplement, everything else is kind of filling in the edges, and it's probably breaking even at best this year. So if you're carrying more stock, if you can support 2 cows an acre with grazing, you're carrying 4, have a look at that stocking rate, because you'll be more profitable if you're not bringing so many inputs this year. So trying to be, because it's happened so quickly, it's really hard to be flexible, especially when it's involved breeding animals. If we're buying in stores, we're saying we've got good grazing management, we just won't buy in quite so many because we can't afford to carry animals on nitrogen alone this year or on feed alone. But when it's breeding animals, it's maybe harder to change the stocking rate quite so quickly. So look at things like replacement heifers, how many do you need to keep? Good time to get rid of cows that aren't performing, so barons, dries, high cell counts. You can be super strict and not carry any passengers because all of the costs, fixed costs included, are all paid with profit, not turnover. So turnover is vanity, profit sanity. Good look at the business. What's an appropriate stocking rate for the business? And take into account, have a look at alternative sources of fodder. So renting more land or buying in silage could still be really viable options for kind of helping the business produce feed or milk or meat kind of economically.
A number of people have said to me that they're considering sort of, they've got some reseeding to do, and they're considering using herbal lays, particularly as it's quite a well-paid option in the countryside stewardship scheme. So I don't know what your advice would be about the use of herbal lays, James. Please.
Yeah, the information we just discussed on these last 2 slides, so soil health, fertiliser, grazing management, farm business, changes there will have an impact this year, almost immediately. You drop out 10 cows that weren't really performing, you didn't like, more grass available for the other cows, you have to feed less supplement, you get the same amount of milk, if not more. That's really tangible and really quick. Same with the grazing management, make that change this week, instantly more grass on farm next week. The herbal lays is more medium-term strategy, isn't it? So, and I'd agree, really useful to look at. They've been proven to perform well in this part of Cornwall, and as they do in other parts of the country, they need to be grazed well. So you need grazing management to be on point, but they don't need any fertiliser, and they're pretty productive, especially once we get kind of, once we get April, mid-April, May onwards through the summer periods. But if you did it this year, you're not going to see the benefit until some point in next year. And it's the same with clover in existing pastures. Yeah, we should set the business up to have more clover so we can reduce reliance on fertiliser, but it's all going to come stuff to do this year for next year. Whereas the stuff we're discussing now, we can do this year for this year. So sure. Medium-term strategy, well worth considering alongside doing this stuff as well first.
Brilliant, thank you.
Good. Back to artificial nitrogen or nitrogen fertiliser. Because of the cost of it, you need a good response rate for it to be economically viable against other alternatives, especially against buying in silage or renting more ground and those sort of options, if that's appropriate. So when it comes to response rate, it depends on how quickly grass is growing. The quicker grass is growing, the more nitrogen it needs. So when weather is warm, soil temperatures are high, there's plenty of moisture, grass could grow really quickly. Nitrogen may genuinely be limiting in that system. So that's when it's more justified. To achieve a good return on investment requires good conditions. So if you're going to use nitrogen, maybe you've got some left over from last year, or you've got some on farm this year and you feel the need to use it, and you've made the other changes we talked about. Where you would use it would be on your new or improved lays, fields with a pH of above 6, with a P&K index of 2 or above, when soil temperature is above 8 degrees, and you only want to apply what the plant genuinely needs. You only want to make up the difference. So some recommended application rates based on soil temperature are between 8 to 10 degrees, 20 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. I think when we share this presentation, I'll translate that into bags an acre to help. 10 to 12 degrees, 30 kilos of nitrogen per hectare, and over 12 degrees, 40 to 50 kilos nitrogen per hectare. Again, should be moisture around, and no other limiting factors, and there should be grass fields that are growing, so we've got some leaf area.
Sure.
This isn't about being special or clever. It's simply saying that if we're going to put £1,000 worth of fertiliser, it needs to give us at least £1,000 of grass back.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So we just want to, we want the best return on investment, and to do that, we want to apply it when the plant needs it, not just to waste it. So based on response rate, and nitrogen fertiliser at around £240 or £250 a tonne, this gives us the cost per kilo of dry matter. So if we apply it too early, too cold, other conditions on fields that are poor fertility, and we get a very low response rate, 5 kilos, which is probably the average response rate for fertiliser that's been applied in February, the cost per kilo of dry matter is huge, more than for concentrate feed. As the response rate reduces or increases, the cost obviously comes down until we get 15s, 17s, 20s. Even at current prices, it's still economically viable. If you put it on to silage grind, you get a really good response, good conditions were good, the grass field's growing well. It's going to help boost the silage yield. It's going to be relatively cheaper than buying in feed in the winter.
Sure.
So it's still viable to use when the response rate's high.
Yep.
This is what it looks like on the graph. The cost of concentrate doesn't change, so that's just flatlining at about 36 pence per kilo dry matter. Other costs, so hay costs you around 12 to 13 pence per kilo dry matter. Silage is a bit less. If you can buy it for £25 a bale, it costs you about 11 pence per kilo dry matter. So you might choose to buy in your silage this year, make up for the shortfall rather than buying fertiliser. If you can rent land and it's relatively productive, the grass that grows, if you manage it well, is really cheap. It's about 4 pence per kilo dry matter. And then fertiliser, urea being the lower line, being a little bit cheaper per kilo of N if it's used responsibly. And then ammonium nitrate, the blue line above, that cost per kilo dry matter comes down as the response rate improves, and you can see where it crosses over. So, using nitrogen is as cheap as buying in round bale silage at £25 a bale if you get really good response rate. So it's all about the response rate, all about using it efficiently when the plant needs it. So you can measure soil temperature with a garden thermometer. Happy days, cheap, easy to use. Buy one off eBay or Amazon or your favorite online marketplace or local store. Do it at 10 a.m, measure a depth of 4 inches, and that will be representative. And we're talking about the average temperature, it's the average day and night temperature. So 10 a.m, between 10 and 12 noon, good time to measure. Do it from the field where you intend to spread. And if you are going to spread fertiliser, why not leave a strip unspread?
Yeah.
And also use your eye. If the field is dark green, it's probably not nitrogen deficient. If it's a limey yellow, yes, it might be. So use your eye, it will tell you what's going on. Don't use it if you don't think it's worthwhile. If you're going to use it, leave an area unspread. Some people do this unintentionally already. See what the return on your investment is. As farmers, we get a lot smarter this year about saying, all the stuff I buy, what is it actually worth to me? Is it giving me a return, or am I just funding someone else to turn up and farm? So measuring using a plate meter, also you can use that control strip and actually accurately measure the difference in the benefit. So my concluding statement would be, nitrogen, as with all farm inputs, in 2022, ask yourself, if I use this input, what's the return on investment going to be back to me? If I give this person £10, are they going to give me £10 back? So ideally, they only give you £15 back because you've got to cover your own fixed costs and labour and so on. So that's where we need to be with our businesses this year.
Brilliant. Thank you, James.
No, I hope everyone found that useful. Actually, I've probably done that slightly. Stop sharing slightly prematurely. I'll bring it back up again. There we go, because I think the last slide is our contact details for.
Sure. Yes.
Lovely. So so people welcome to get people within the Penwith region, welcome to get in touch with Phil or myself, and we can help you in a number of ways. I can help with grazing management advice. Hey, look, can be really useful. Could be worth, I don't know, 5 to 50 grand to a lot of businesses this year if they get the grazing management improved, save on inputs, maintain performance. Phil, you've got quite a few options to help people with.
Yeah, we can come out and we can do some free soil sampling for you. If you haven't made use of that service before, we can do some compaction testing for you. And we've also got an aerator available for hire at £60 a day. So any of those options are available if you want to drop me a line on email or give me a ring on the mobile. Thank you.
And in terms of conditions, aeration, needs to be used carefully, because in the wrong conditions, just going to be burning expensive diesel now for no benefit.
Yep.
Conditions at the moment probably almost perfect. Ground might even be too dry this week to be used. So yeah, where there is a pan, I guess that aerator works really in the top 4 inches, doesn't it, Phil? So it's a pan from grazing animals that it will help to break up and get air back into that soil. So it can be really useful tool to use this season.
Yeah, and we've had some it's been well used this spring. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Very good. Right, we'll wrap up there. And thanks everyone for their time, and I hope they enjoyed this webinar recording. And
thanks, James.
People. Cheers, Phil.
Cheers, everybody.